Welcome to the Atlantic Current. I am Vince Martin from Wall Street in Maine, joined as always by Tull McAdoo from the Irish Politics Newsletter. Our topic today is fascinating, complex, sometimes absurd, and quite often grim. We are talking about guns in America, along with Ireland and Europe. Perhaps the aspect of life and of society that is most different between the U.S. and other Western countries, particularly European countries. So let's start there, Tull. What is the perception in Ireland and Europe of America's attitude towards guns?
Hello, listeners. Vincent, it's a grim topic, almost. You switch on what you would call cable news in the United States, and there's endless debates about gun rights and gun crime and gun shootings. The debate over there is always very vocal, it's always quite partisan. Your parts of your legislators insist that, it's nothing got to do with a nation's character or anything like that. But from the outside looking in, it does appear that way. And in most countries, a firearm is a grim object brought out, for war, hunting, or in the occasional police raid, I suppose. In the United States, it's a lifestyle accessory and very much goes to part of your political identity, I feel. Hobby, a grievance, and a piece of theology. And in the psyche of the United States.
Yeah, I can definitely appreciate that a little bit. Guns are cultural in a way that I think a lot of Americans don't realize. And that's particularly true for someone like myself, because I'm less familiar with guns than the average American. I didn't really grow up around them. Saw them a few times, fired them a couple times, but they certainly were not part of my daily life. For a lot of Americans, they truly are. For a lot of American children, grow up in households where guns are around constantly. And when you say you call it a lifestyle accessory, I mean, that's kind of brutally honest and brutally correct. And the town where I live in is as suburban as an American suburb gets. Quiet, kind of sleepy, a very nice place. And you see pickup trucks driving around here with gun decals on the back, and you're kind of behind them at a traffic light. And dude, I live where you live. You don't need an AR-15. Yeah. You don't need a sticker on your pickup truck. And by the way, you don't need the pickup truck either, but that's a different, you're an accounting manager for a global pharmaceutical company, buddy. But yeah, I mean, you're right. It's tied up into masculinity. It's tied up in all sorts of things. It is absolutely a cultural thing. And I'm imagining that that's not the case in Ireland.
No, it's not at all. It's a very much a recreational / farming thing. Ireland's not a high gun ownership country even by European standards, never mind the United States standards. Gun crime gets massive attention because it's often tied to organised crime. When you hear guns being mentioned in the media, it's usually related to that, and it's not a debate about who should have guns or who shouldn't have guns. In other words, the headline numbers are low compared to countries like the USA, and the impact of guns is always concentrated and violent. I think the Department of Justice said there's about 200,000 licensed guns in the country, which works out at 4 guns per 100 people. They're mostly shotguns and rifles. You're not going to be getting anybody applying for AR-15s over here, the kind of way.
Yeah, there's two things that stand out there from the American perspective. And the first is that you mentioned shotguns and rifles. You didn't mention handguns, which nowadays are a majority of American firearm sales are handguns. And that is a way that we're really unique. We're going to kind of talk about that in a little bit. The broader number, though, is really something to hear. You said that there are 4 guns per 100 people in Ireland. That's all that's all the licensed guns, right?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. I'm pretty sure there's, some farms might have the odd illegal shotgun. And
right.
Like that,
yeah, because in the United States, the last few years, average gun sales have been about 15 million units a year, which means that Americans every year buy 4 guns per 100 people. So you're saying all the guns that the Irish people have managed to accumulate to this point, we do that every year. Broader estimates here, if you include unlicensed guns, is that there's something like 110 to 120 guns per 100 people. We have more guns than people in this country.
Let me ask you this. How easy is it to get a license, Vince?
It depends on where you are. Gun laws here are really quite a patchwork of federal, state. Federal government has kind of guaranteed certain rights, although even a lot of that has come through the Supreme Court. The big decision this century was Heller in 2008 The District of Columbia said that individuals couldn't own handguns, and the Supreme Court struck that law down. That was kind of the final confirmation that the current interpretation of the Constitution is that individuals have the right to bear arms for self-defense. States do have the ability to kind of try and exclude people and keep various kinds of people from owning firearms, and those wind up being contested in court. So it is incredibly complex, to the point that gun owners, if they want to travel with their gun, actually have to pay really close attention, because the way that gun laws work here, it's not terribly hard to accidentally commit a gun felony by bringing the wrong kind of gun in the wrong kind of way into the wrong state. So yeah, that part of it's just kind of a mess. You could do it in an entire podcast episode on trying to unpack all that. And even within that, there would be people contesting, telling you, oh, no, that's actually not what the law says. Very helpful for a product like this, which is killing 45,000 people a year.
Is it that many people? 45,000 people a year? Whoa. I mean, I don't think we've had any gun crime. I don't think we had any gun killings in Ireland in 2025. Not even a gangland murder.
That's amazing. Yeah.
You know, now you say you buy the most guns in the world, probably per head of population. And that would seem to indicate that it's quite easy to get a gun license. You know, you talk about people being states trying to exclude people from getting gun licenses, but it seems Tull could rock on over tomorrow and get a gun license pretty handily.
We have more guns than anyone else per capita. It's not even close. There's a Wikipedia page we'll put in the Substack show notes that summarizes a study from 2017. And that study tried really hard to get not just licensed, but illicit guns all over the world. U.S. has got double anyone else. Number 2 is Kurdistan. Number 4 is Yemen.
Oh.
Just to give you an idea of like who else we're competing with. I think in that study they said Ireland, including illicit and unlicensed weapons, was like 7 per 100. Yeah. So the U.S. has 16 times as many guns. But yeah, I think the one thing that broad number does obscure, and some people overseas may not understand, is that guns here still have a huge split. You go, oh, you know, there's more than one gun for every person. You know, there must be guns everywhere. It must be guns in every home. But I think that most surveys suggest that right now there's about 40% of households have guns. Whoa. So a lot of those guns, it's just the fact that some of those households have 5, 10, in some cases 20, 25, 30, believe it or not.
For self-defense.
Yeah, I guess. One of the things that's always funny is, to me, is I love reading Irish history, and particularly modern Irish history. And you go back to the Civil War, or even fighting against the British, and there's these stories about how the IRA executed a daring nighttime raid of some storehouse. And then, like, the end of the story, it's like, oh, they got 38 guns. They got 38 rifles. And like, as an American, you're like, holy shit. Like, there's some 400-person town in Kansas that has like 380 guns. You know? But yeah, it is really a split, and that's something I would point out.
Yes, that was back in West Cork. They'd raid the RAC barracks, but guns weren't as prevalent back then as they are now. I have a funny story about being introduced to guns in the United States in your part of the world, Vincent. And a fellow colleague invited us around to his farm, with his farmhouse he had a lot of land on it in rural North Carolina, and he says, "Do you want to go shooting, guys?" And I go, "All right, okay, let's do this." And he opens his wall, and he'd all assortment of machine guns on a wall. He must have had maybe 30 of them on a wall, big massive things, like something you'd see out of Rambo or something like that.
Yeah.
And I was shocked. 2 my friends that were with me had never shot a gun before. Okay, so he hands him the gun, and he turns around and says, "So you know what you're doing? You're all in the IRA over there." And we were like, what? But nobody's in the IRA here. Anyway, I learned 2 things about that day, and that Americans love their guns, and they assume everybody else loves guns as well. We didn't want to touch them, but we didn't want to be rude guests. Yeah, that was an eye-opening experience. But he did have, and they were all machine guns. There was no handguns, no shotguns, no rifles, all machine guns. You think of how places get shot up so easily, and I'm thinking it must be so easy, like, you know. If you want to shoot someplace up, it's not going to be hard work.
No, you're right. It's not terribly hard to acquire those weapons, unfortunately. That story you're telling is completely familiar to me. When I lived in Oklahoma, I had friends like, well, what are you going to do on July 4th? I'm like, oh, well, buddy's got a whole bunch of land. We're going to go take some rifles out. We got some tracers. So, if you're not familiar with tracer, it's basically a form of ammunition you can fire at night and you can watch it. Instead of shooting off fireworks, you get a bolt action rifle and you're firing tracers across 300 acres, just randomly piling bullets into trees. Yeah. And it's completely normal. They're just part of your culture. They're part of what you do, even when you're bored. You hunt, you shoot, you just kind of have them around. And that's a big part, I think, of why the political divide is so big. To people who grew up without guns, they are terrifying. And they can't understand why on earth you would need an AR-15. Why do you need this firepower? But to people who grew up with guns, trying to regulate them, particularly trying to ban them, it's like trying to ban an automobile because, people die in car accidents. To them, it's almost equally nonsensical. It is a tool and it gets used the wrong way, but so do all tools. So do automobiles, so do knives.
Yes, they're tools of death, though, whatever way you look at them. Is there a noticeable urban-rural divide here, Vincent?
Yeah, very much so.
Like in Ireland, I mean, there's only kind of two reasons for having a gun. That's, killing pests on the farm or the humane killing of animals or recreational purposes for, shooting targets. Now, I'm surrounded in a very rural area and, all the farmers might have a gun or, you don't even see guns on our policemen over here, Vincent. All right. So you're a normal on the beat cop. I'm sure this is going to come as a massive surprise to you. If I get pulled over for some shifty driving on the motorway, he's going to come up to my window, open the door, give me a bollocking and, there's a couple of points on your license and a fine. On off you go. Now, I look at America and if I happen to be driving in the United States and I see a cop car pull up over me, I think I'm going to get shot dead because they're all armed and they're all incredibly well armed as well. Over here, the local policeman, the guard that will come up to you and he's not armed. Now, we've specially armed units and detectives will have their firearms and stuff like that, but your ordinary decent copper, he's not carrying any firearms. They make me very nervous when I see them on cops. They're not very well played and stuff like that. It always makes me a bit edgy.
I think that's true for people here. If you're not familiar with guns, they are anxiety inducing kind of instantly. If you are familiar with guns, they're just kind of a hunk of metal that does, as they see it, sometimes cool. So that's why we have the divide and we have a massive split here. That's part of why the politics here are so complex, is that people are just looking at this as almost a completely different object. People who are pro-gun control, the guns have almost no legitimate use, particularly for individuals, whereas for people who are the most ardently pro-gun, pro-Second Amendment, as we put it here, it's the tool to defend yourself and it's a tool to defend your society. It's that cultural way of life thing.
Right. So it's a great American contradiction there,
Yeah.
People who distrust government so much, they'll arm themselves to the teeth and then ask that same government to keep other armed Americans from doing the same. On the other hand, the result is a national pageant of locked safes, lobbyists, school drills, Vincent, school drills, children doing active shooter school drills, and then you got your morally exhausted headlines. And I suspect at some level everybody knows the system is absurd, but nobody wants to be the first to put their gun down, right?
I think people invested in it kind of don't necessarily think it's absurd, particularly on the right. But the idea that nobody wants to be the first to put their rifle down is a big part of the political thing. It is a weird political issue in a couple ways. One is the fact that because both sides are kind of so hard and because their views are so polarized, neither side wants to give an inch. And this is particularly true on the right. We're going to discuss that. But, the idea for Second Amendment purists is basically that any restriction on a gun is a step towards outright tyranny. It's a step down that path. You allow one restriction, then it keeps going and it keeps going. And all of a sudden you don't have guns. And once you don't have guns, then the American government will run you over. Which, by the way, I cannot think of a political position in this country that is more nauseating than this anti-tyranny Second Amendment. I cannot stand it. And for what it's worth, I get some of the arguments for reasonable gun ownership and all, but this idea Oh, yeah, we need to do that to fight a tyrannical government. First of all, I don't care how many guns you have, you ain't winning. This is 2026. All right, buddy? Yeah, you and your Ford F-150 and your AR-15 and your 45, you're not taking down the FBI, let alone the United States Army. But on that point, too, like, it's amazing how many people make that argument without realizing what a slur it is against the United States military.
Yeah.
And I think they would say, oh, well, no, we're not talking about the military. We're talking about the government. We're talking about the FBI. No, that's not how this works. That's not the argument. It might be the argument you think you're making. But if you're saying we need this massively armed populace to protect ourselves against government, what you're basically saying is that the United States Army could rise up and try and repress you, which is such a slur. And it's also just, it's really just a dark way to look at the world. It's a dark way to look at your government. It's a dark way to look at your fellow citizens. I understand if they want to say historically that's kind of what the point was. And, you know, when the Bill of Rights was passed in the late 1780s, that's fine. But when the Bill of Rights were passed, there were some other historical attitudes too that we probably don't want to have. And this really should be one that's in the dustbin rather than you cosplaying as some American patriot because you can spend $6,000 on rifles that you probably don't 100% know how to handle.
Well, yes, isn't American FBI history littered with them attacking compounds and, you know, attacking well-armed militias and stuff like that? And the well-armed militias always lose.
For the most part, yeah. The FBI, we had a militia movement. You know, they actually called themselves militias, which is a reference to the Second Amendment itself. That's the first line. And that has been part of the constitutional debate for a long time. Does the Bill of Rights give individuals the right to bear arms for self-defense, or is it allowing for the creation of state-level militias for defense against things like, you know, Native Americans and all? And that, again, in 2008, that Supreme Court case has kind of settled that argument for now.
Well, like when the framers, that's what you call your guys that did your constitution, the framers, yes? I think when they wrote about a well-regulated militia, presumably they meant a group of farm boys who, if could, called upon, chase off the redcoats, chase the British away.
Yeah, or a raiding tribe or something like that.
Yeah, not as you alluded to earlier, you know, a middle-aged tax guy driving a pickup truck in tactical gear. I've seen that a few times on those Discovery Channel programs. What do you do for a living? Oh, I'm corporate lawyer, and he's armed to the teeth like something you'd see on a computer game. And you're like, really? Yeah,
there is some fake masculinity that gets tied into it sometimes.
Yeah, it's a strange romance almost, isn't it?
Yeah. And look, gun owners will push back against that and say, you know, oh, no, it's not about fake masculinity. It's not about fear. But we actually do know fear is a big driver of it because we know how many background checks are run. And in America, you have to have a background check run before you buy a firearm. So we have a sense of how many guns are sold legally. The numbers spike whenever people get afraid. And the most obvious time that this happened was during the coronavirus pandemic. Gun sales went through the roof. There's something telling about that because an AR-15 is not, you know, you're not shooting the virus. So, you know, I don't know if people were getting ready for they thought zombie hordes were coming. But the other time we see gun sales spike is every time a Democrat wins the Oval Office. We saw this in 2008, 2009, and we saw it again in late 20 into 2021.
Sorry, Vincent, if I was going to impose tyranny or you know, come to take all your arms, I suspect very strongly it wouldn't be a Democrat that would be doing it. For the simple reason that they just don't have the ability to. They don't have that presence and force of personality the Democrats do to win the argument to take your guns away from you. You know?
You're not getting it, Tull. They're hidden tyrants. That's what every Republican presidential candidate has told you this century. At the national level, that's the debate every time. And we actually, in the literal debate in 2024 between Trump and Harris, the guns didn't really come up much at all, which is kind of stunning. Trump 3 separate times said Harris is going to confiscate your guns.
Whoa.
Harris said once, no, I own a gun. My vice presidential nominee, Tim Walz, owns a gun. We're not anti-gun. And that is what the national debate here is every year. The Republicans say, without real evidence, the Democrats are going to take your guns. The Democrats say, no, we're not going to take guns. We're just for smarter, more effective gun control. Neither side gives any evidence for what they're saying or any detail of what they mean. And we just everybody just shrugs and move on. At a national level, it is bizarrely not an issue given, again, there's 44,000 gun deaths a year. I think 16,000 gun homicides at 24. I mean, even the accidental deaths, there's 450, 500 accidental gun deaths here a year.
What? How are people accidentally killing other people with guns?
Yeah. Hunting accidents, people cleaning their gun the wrong way, things like that. But 500 people.
Didn't Dick Cheney, your vice president, accidentally shoot somebody, now that I think about it?
He shot somebody in the face on a hunting trip.
Or something.
Yeah. He shot somebody right in the face. Yeah.
Oh my God! Yeah, one of his top donors that I'm donating to, Dick Cheney, he goes and shoots me in the face. There's the thanks you get, huh?
But yeah, and so the politics of it are just bizarre that we have all these terrible things happening, and I imagine that's got to be part of the European bewilderment at what's going on here, because I think even a lot of Americans go, this is nuts. This is a real problem. Why are we not doing anything about it? Why can't we do anything about it?
Yeah, Vincent, it leaves me enraged sometimes as a European, particularly around school shootings. Adults kill each other with guns all the time. They own that stuff. That's your own business. But you've got people going into schools and they're shooting the places up, and they're designing schools in the United States now to make it harder for people to commit mass murders in them. And there's something very, very wrong with the psychology of that. And that, just from the outside looking in, like, you could easily change your laws to stop this happening, and you're not.
Yeah. You could change the laws to slow it down. I don't know at this point that we can stop it happening, but we had a school shooting in Uvalde, Texas in 2022, which was particularly brutal. Senator Ted Cruz came out at the time, quite famously, and he said, well, we need better doors.
Yeah.
And a lot of Americans are like, what the are you talking about, man? Kids are slaughtered. Oh, no, it's not gun laws. It's not gun laws. We need better doors. And Cruz is a pretty influential senator. He's going, oh, well, you need everybody in school to go through one door. You have one door and there's an armed guard, and then this is all taken care of. And people actually run schools are like, there are American schools that have 5,000 kids. How long does it take 5,000 kids to get through one door? And there is a horrible tweet from a British journalist, actually, which kind of proves your point about how looking in and being enraged. And he was referring to the Sandy Hook massacre, which took place in late 2012, which was, just a horrible, horrible thing. And he said in 2015, his tweet, and it still goes around, and the quote is, in retrospect, Sandy Hook marked the end of the U.S. gun control debate. Once America decided killing children was bearable, it was over.
Yeah.
And that, and that's what you're saying there, that we have kind of decided that's kind of the price that you pay for the Second Amendment. And it's a horrifying conclusion to draw. But I think, honestly, that said, I do understand why some Americans kind of think that there's nothing to be done.
That's the nation writing its own obituary right there. And, I love the United States. People listening to this podcast, I said, Tull, you're very hard in the United States, but I love it. I love it.
Yeah. Well, you're hard on us because you believe in us and you trust us, and
yes.
you're like a stern parent.
my problem isn't that I'm cynical enough about the United States. It's that I still have hope.
Yeah, for sure.
I still have hope. And all the indicators otherwise are saying I should give up in this hope business. Like supporting Munster rugby. But like the Sandy Hook, it was awful and it was terrible. So many children were killed. But it became infamous because of an Alex Jones peddled conspiracy theory. There was a whole cottage industry of conspiracy theories grew up around these murders, Vincent. And the argument was, made primarily by Alex Jones and others on the right and far right, was that the children that were murdered were actors. The parents outside seen afterwards were actors. They were all paid actors because the American government wants to take your guns away.
Yeah, and about 2 years after that, presidential candidate Donald Trump told Alex Jones, quote, your reputation is amazing. I will not let you down, which tells you how much that stuff has bled into mainstream American politics and culture.
He was eventually sued, and was $2 billion or something like that he was?
Yeah, he was sued for defamation by the parents and lost a trademark to his InfoWars media empire. And There's been a whole bunch of legal wrangling, so it's been a whole mess. But I cannot imagine how people. There are like millions of his listeners to go, yeah, well, he was wrong about that, but he's right about other stuff. And you just want to scream at him or grab him by the throat, like he's just a lunatic. The fact that he has any purchase in this country is horrifying in the context of this debate or any other. But yeah, that idea of the government is going to take your guns. It sounds satirical. It sounds like something, from like a character in South Park would say, and
something I might write.
Yeah. People believe it. It is absolutely an animating belief on the right wing. Again, we talked about the fact that gun sales spike when Democrats take over. We talk about the fact that politicians in the Republican Party can't negotiate because of this. And we have kind of a really staggering example of this. There's a member of the House of Representatives from Texas named Dan Crenshaw.
Yes, ex-soldiers.
Yeah, Iraq War veteran. You may have seen him. I believe he's the only congressperson who wears an eye patch. Lost an eye while serving in Afghanistan. And the Republican primary was held just last month. So Crenshaw was elected in 2018. He was running for his fifth term. He lost his primary, lost the Republican primary in Texas. And according to him, this is an interview he himself gave, one of the big problems he had and one of the big errors he made was that in 2019, he went on a podcast. 2019 went on a podcast and said local officials in Texas should consider discussing red flag gun laws.
What are they, Vincent?
A red flag gun law is a law that basically says if you are red flagged, you have some character issue. You are suspected or convicted of domestic violence. You have mental illness. The state can take your gun away. And this really gets to why there's just no political movement on guns in this country, because this seems like a pretty common sense thing, right? I mean, I imagine most European listeners would go, okay, yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
And if you're an outsider, you might think, oh, Crenshaw must have lost his seat because he came out against red flag gun laws. No, perspectives towards guns in places like Texas are so skewed politically that 7 years ago, he said that state legislators, not federal legislators, which he is now, should consider these laws. His primary opponent advertised over and over again, oh, look, this is red flag law, Dan. And because the argument from gun rights people is red flag laws are a huge restriction on the Second Amendment, because even though they sound great, even though it sounds smart to the average American that a domestic abuser should lose their firearms, it's the first step. Like everything else in the gun control debate, that's the first step. The government, if you allow the government to have a red flag law for domestic abusers, then they'll expand it to, people who are convicted of battery, right? So then if you get in a bar fight when you're 19, you won't be able to own a gun. And then they'll keep stretching it. And eventually the Second Amendment will be gone. That perspective keeps us from having gun laws that in some cases, like more than 80% of Americans support. But because of how primaries work and because we have districts in places like Texas where the primary is the general, right? If you win the Republican nomination in this district, that's it. The general election is a formality. So you wind up with this real extremism, mostly on the right, a little bit on the left. But that election itself, if you take a step back, it's absolutely insane.
So this brings me, who's influencing this election? Is the National Rifle Association and the NRA?
The NRA is going to always be involved in that stuff. They grade all the congressmen and the candidates based on their policies and things like that. They do have a pretty outsized role and a pretty outsized reputation. But like a lot of cases in democracy and in lobbying, they're only effective because people have some underlying beliefs that they share with the NRA. Now, they have shaped the debate. They have created people who are more willing to believe that red flag laws are a constitutional threat rather than a common sense regulation. But yeah, they have a huge influence on the right. And again, because we're polarized, because the Senate has outsized representation for rural areas, which are generally more pro-gun, their role at the national level is magnified many, many times greater than their membership would suggest, or than the actual politics of gun owners would suggest. Most of these common sense things, gun owners, regular, normal gun owners actually support, if you look at polling. they are a big reason why we don't have sort of a grand compromise over guns. And we could have a grand compromise over.
Do the NRA fund politicians? They make donations to politicians?
They make, huge donations. Yeah. They kind of switched their focus back in the 1970s. They weren't a political organization until then. That's a relatively new thing. They started pushing the idea of guns being used for self-defense, and then they were also instrumental in creating the whole cult around the handgun, which itself is essentially something that's happened in my lifetime. Right. You know, people in the 1950s did not own handguns.
I mean, they've come a long way from being founded as a Civil War Veterans Association or something, was it?
Yeah, they are founded by veterans of the Union cause in the Civil War because the soldiers that served on the Union side were so terrible that they actually legitimately created an association to teach Americans how to shoot so that the next time we had a war where we had to draft people, they could handle a firearm. There's actually a survey, I believe it is actually done by the American government at the time, that for every 1,000 bullets Union soldiers fired, one hit a Confederate. They were essentially the worst shots in global history. Yeah, that's the NRA was kind of like an educational and a training organization, you know, to learn how to shoot rifles in particular. That's why it's in the name. The political turn came in the 70s as part of a broader shift in the American right wing. You can't divorce from that. That shift in the 70s, the rise of militias in the 90s. The idea that the Second Amendment is there to prevent the tyranny of government is an idea that came from that movement in the 90s, and it's now completely mainstreamed within conservative media and conservative politics.
Yes, yeah. The NRA are a very shady organization, though. You know, there's been embezzlement allegations, Russian cash whispers, I believe. Past Wayne LaPierre, am I pronouncing that right, Vincent? Where he went off to Russia for a bit to court some Russian money. Yeah,
Wayne LaPierre, and found liable in the civil case in New York State for misusing over $4 million of funds, dresses in $7,000 suits. There's some rough stories about his actual hunting exploits. Basically, he's the head of the NRA and he kind of can't really fire a gun. He's just a scumbag, irrespective of his views on guns. Just as a human being, he's pretty far down there.
And he's gone now. There was a boardroom fight that would make succession look like a prayer meeting or something.
But yeah, the NRA has really changed the debate to put handguns front and center, to put self-defense front and center. People here were always, you know, comfortable with rifles, and I think in a way that was different. My father used to come home from school in central New Jersey, and he'd grab his rifle and they'd go hunt squirrels and rabbits with his brothers. I've been told it's true that my grandmother evidently was expert at frying squirrel.
God, right.
Evidently, it was really good. I'm not sure if there's some rose-colored glasses there, but he was 12 years old and he took his 7 and 8-year-old brothers out with their old rifles and went hunting. And so that kind of sense is fine. Where it's different, again, is I think what you've talked about with the mythology, the merchandising around it, the decals. And I mean, you see so many people, again, in this suburb, a T-shirt, and then you look, there's a little AR-15 like on the sleeve of the T-shirt, or, you know, the American flag with bullets, all this stuff. There is just kind of a mythology to it. And I think that plus the constitutional nature of the protection, it does change the debate. It makes it harder to get anything done.
So it's evolved, what you're saying is it's evolved over the years from, you know, the Huckleberry Finn type scenario where you throw your gun over the shoulder, head to the fields, right, some squirrels and rabbits, to something far more nefarious.
I mean, this has been a 60-year political campaign. The NRA is only part of it. But to change the perception towards guns, to change laws, to increase concealed carry, to increase open carry laws, to lower restrictions, all these sorts of things. It has been a constant concerted effort from the right, from pro-Second Amendment people to do that. And the left really has not had much of an answer for it.
Vincent, there was famously an assault weapons ban at one stage. But no, you can buy an assault weapon again if you want in some states, I suppose. Well, what happened there?
Yeah, there was a big gun control push that had some success. There was what was called the Brady Bill in 1993, and then the assault weapons ban came in 1994. So it really did look like gun control advocates were winning if you look at the history of polling. But the assault weapons bill, the one concession the Republicans managed to wrangle was that it had to be renewed within 10 years. It had what we call a sunset provision. So it went on the books, but only for 10 years. And then 9/11 hit. Again, we talked about how fear is a part of the culture around guns. It is. After 9/11, people everywhere buy guns. The right gets much more entrenched towards guns, much more focused on the constitutional nature of it. Even Americans, I mean, heck, some listeners may not be old enough, but some listeners probably forgotten how many Americans believe that there were sleeper cells. You know, there were Afghani terrorists just hiding in Buffalo, New York, and outside Chicago waiting to strike. So that drove gun ownership higher.
I know you're hearing the same about Iranian sleeper cells.
Yeah.
History is repeating itself.
And so many ways, right?
Yeah. Yeah, history is repeating itself, Vincent. I mean, the Second Amendment is, I suppose, it's more like a bandage on the wounds of a nation, you know?
Yeah.
And this is what it all comes down to, is the Second Amendment, essentially, isn't it?
I think it's a huge boon to the right, not just legally, but culturally, that it's part of the Constitution, because that's pretty rare. There was a historical review in 2013 cited by the New York Times that said, in all of human history, there have been 15 constitutions that confer gun rights. And I think the number right now, excluding the U.S., there's like 2, 3, or 4, depending on how you define it, countries with gun rights in their constitution. Evidently, Czechia has joined the club in the last couple of years, which might explain why they were comfortable hosting Ireland fans this week. But yeah, sorry to Irish listeners for that one.
That's very poor behavior from you, Vincent. Yes. Anyway, moving swiftly on.
But it's notable that out of all those 15 countries, which again is the entirety of human history, the U.S. is the only one where the right doesn't include specific limitations as well. We are really, really unique in that. It also gives a small minority of the right really outsized power in controlling gun policy. Because if you don't satisfy those people, you aren't going to win the Republican primary. And if you don't win the Republican primary, you won't be elected. It is sad because Europeans look at us and go, why don't you do anything about this? There's actually a lot that we could do. There's a lot that Americans do agree on, at the very least, just in terms of things like how guns are sold, what kind of guns can be sold, restrictions on magazine size, restrictions on age. You know, should you have to be 21 instead of 18? There are a lot of things that a pretty solid majority of Americans agree on. You know, there is room for a grand compromise, I think, in theory, where Democrats and Republicans could come together and the Democrats would concede that individual gun ownership is a right, that is a guaranteed right. You know, make it a constitutional amendment. Take away this whole, Kamala Harris is going to take away your guns nonsense. Whereas Republicans cede common sense things on small magazine size, focus on guns that are needed for hunting and self-defense, you know, restrictions on ownership, things like that. And in terms of polling, there's a way to do it. In terms of our political structure, this is like the worst possible issue for how the United States government is set up. And there is one horrible irony, is that in my lifetime, there has been one person, and I don't mean one president, there's been one person who could make that kind of compromise, and that's Donald Trump.
Right.
He has been the only political figure that has existed that could actually broker a huge gun deal that would make big change, that would get both sides, because there's enough of the Republican Second Amendment people that would trust him, you know. And I do think it is a little bit of a shame that he has not really tried to tackle that issue. He's the only person who has a political constituency to do that. And it's stunning.
Vincent, I'm deeply cynical about the politics of all this, you know, and only because of what you said to me. I'm 250 years on, you're debating if arms includes, you know, thermobaric launchers, machine guns, whatever, or is it just a gentleman's sport or sporting rifle? I mean, an AR-15 can shoot, was it 40 to 60 bullets a minute or something, is it?
Yeah, yeah.
You're having arguments with yourself about, you know, magazine sizes and what's classified, you know, as an assault weapon or not an assault weapon and stuff like that. And you're skirting around the edges. I mean, say, for example, a left-wing person got elected Prime Minister in Ireland, Ivana Bakic or Mary Lou MacDonald, you know, My first thought isn't to go out and buy an AR-15. Okay. My first
Not
thought
even, not even if it was Catherine Connolly.
Not even if Catherine Connolly was elected president, and I didn't want to go out and get a gun. And there's something deeply wrong with the psychosis of a nation that if your first inclination is to go out and buy a gun because somebody you don't like got elected,
Yeah.
Have you ever been tempted to buy a gun, Vincent?
No. But I'm kind of like a dope. Like that's kind of like I fired guns. I don't have like an intrinsic revulsion to them being in front of me. I fired them. I've seen them fired. It's fine. But I'm also an idiot. I forget where I put it. I'd be chasing the dog around the house and, knock it over. I'd leave it out somewhere. The dog would set it off, put a hole in the window. Like it's more like that kind of thing. And again, like where we live, this whole idea of, I need it. My home is my castle. I need it for self-defense. Like, come on, man. Not here. I mean, at the end of the day, for me, it's a mathematical calculation. The odds of me hurting myself with it are about 1 million times greater than the odds of me successfully defending my home.
I'm actually coming back to thinking about something there with these guns, and then they go off and do their mass shootings and stuff like that. I mean, it's almost like a state-sanctioned murder spree, isn't it? I mean, like the government are enabling these people, they're not hindering them.
I think that's the argument from the left. They need to be hindered. The argument from the right is always going to be that, you're not enabling them because you can't stop them. And the sad thing is they're not entirely wrong, because when you have 380 million guns in a country, that alone handcuffs your abilities to do anything. You say, oh, you can't sell guns here anymore. Okay. I mean, what is that? I mean, in practical terms, what is that doing? There's 380 million guns out there, by estimate. So that's always the right-wing argument to all this stuff. Other than Ted Cruz and his doors, it's the right-wing line. The only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. And even the state level stuff, they point to, Chicago has really strict gun laws and terrible gun crime. So obviously gun laws don't work. The other pithy one is, if you outlaw guns, only outlaws will have guns. Right?
Yeah.
The bad guys aren't going to follow the rules. It's only the good guys that do. So the more rules you have, the fewer good guys you have with guns.
For me, Vincent, the debate itself is the truest American pathology. One camp shrieks of jackboots on the stairs and on your neck and invading your home, while they hoard AR-15s and other manners of death machines against, theoretically, the US Army is what they're arming themselves against, as you said earlier. Then on the left, you have the chants and the homilies, the common sense, as if exercising guns from the American conscience would cauterize the heart of the empire's malaise.
Yeah. Or that we wouldn't be a violent people.
I think the Civil War in America is already spiritual as opposed to physical. People talk about modern culture wars, but there's been a culture war going on in America since the 60s, I think.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that is the dividing line, is the 1960s for sure. We're still fighting that battle 60 years on.
Yeah, and it just takes on different guises, doesn't it?
Yeah. And I think that's a good way, if a dark way, to end, is the idea that these arguments over guns are practical and not emotional is an absolute illusion. And one of the things that really shows you that, I think, is that the idea of handguns in particular as self-defense is, if you understand guns at all, is completely and totally asinine. Like, you asked if I have a gun in the house. If I was ever going to have a gun in a house, it would not be a handgun. If you are not trained in handguns, if you are not a police officer, former military, or whatever it is, having a handgun when someone knocks on your door at 2:30 in the morning is a terrible, terrible idea. It's not that easy to aim a handgun even up close. It's not a good tool for self-defense. And you walking around with one in your purse or your back pocket or whatever is not really any better. If you're not used to those situations, the adrenaline's coming and your vision's narrowing and all that stuff, there's one weapon that you actually want to have, which is a shotgun, because the shotgun sprays. You almost can't miss at close range with a shotgun. And so the fact that you have this idea of self-defense coinciding with the rise of handgun sales going from almost zero to, I think the number is now like 55% of purchases. that alone, I think, is really a tell as to what's going on here. And I think that's a huge piece of evidence in the point that you're making, that there's a pathology here, that there's a fear here. Because if you are someone who truly believes that the Second Amendment protects your right to individual self-defense, and if you are truly saying, I own gun because I need to protect my family, a 38 caliber handgun is a stupid, stupid thing to do.
Yeah.
And if you own that, it's telling me that either you like having that in your hand, or you like the pretense, or you don't understand what you're doing. That's really such a dark and frustrating way to end, but there's no other way to end this episode, is there?
Yes, my usual bonhomie backslapping observational humor wasn't going to work here, Vincent. So.
No, this is not one for jokes.
No, it's not. It was grim and a sad reminder of the current state of the land of the free.
Yeah.
So,
you know what? Let's close on one positive, which is probably insane in the context discussion we had. Crime is at 125-year low in America.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
all those numbers, let's bear in mind that at the very least, it used to be a lot worse.
Okay, fair enough. Well, Vincent, I'm off to buy a gun in case Mary Lee MacDonald or Ivana Bakic gets elected Taoiseach Prime Minister. I'm Tull from the Irish Politics Newsletter.
And I'm Vince Martin from Wall Street in Maine.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye now.